I do not approve of the predilection of the masses of our contemporaries to locate miracles in scripture as often as they can, to the extent that they seize any opportunity to interpret a text supernaturally. Ironically, this does not reinforce the existence of miracles, but weakens it, since in many cases they miss the real intent of the verses. Okay, I guess we've gone to screen share. Okay. Here you go, source number 3. So in other words, his point is that the so-called masses, who he's not happy with right now, now I just have to get where to see your chats. It's a little more complicated for me.
I can stop it, sorry.
Okay, that makes it easier then. Great. But if somebody needs it, that's fine. I'm really okay with it. I just have to make sure that I can see chat also. That's my obligation as an educator. And if I see fewer of you, too bad. I miss seeing you. But if people need the sources, that's fine. Do what you got to do. All right. So anyway, getting back to source 3, he condemns the masses who are finding zzz everywhere, even in places where there's utterly no reason within the text itself to find that. So he feels that this is just a distortion of what the biblical message is. But then he goes after the philosophers, even though he is one of the philosophers. The conduct of some of our co-religionists who think highly of themselves, he obviously wants to distance himself from the philosophers who over-philosophize, is likewise erroneous if they try to reconcile everything in scripture with nature. I prefer to interpret each text independently, truthfully, and contextually. Okay, so his bias is that his view is correct, not surprisingly. His view is, look, if the text pushes a miracle, so it's a miracle. And if the text is open to a more naturalistic interpretation, that's cool. But let's listen to what the voice of the text is. Okay, so that sounds the best to me, just because whenever it's even-handed and your options are open, that's great. But again, we're just going to go through some of my personal favorite examples, culminating with the plagues, but many more things before the plagues, where our commentators have to figure out how to deal with just how do you read. So here's a good one. Mrs. Lot. You know, there's a story where God destroys the city of Sodom and its suburbs in the book of Genesis, and they were wicked towns, and God smites them down. Okay, so the angels who were rescuing Lot and his family instructed Lot and his family not to look behind them. Just get out of there and look forward and get out. Okay, so then Mrs. Lot did not listen to that warning. And so source number 4, I'll read it in English, but you have the Hebrew as well. Lot's wife looked back, and she thereupon turned into a pillar of salt. Okay, so our JPS translation here, that's what I'm using, has a side in terms of how to interpret the text. But look at the Hebrew. That Lot's wife looked behind her. All right, which our translator is taking to mean, and she became a pillar of salt. Okay, so that sounds like, right? That sounds like God is doing something that is, I don't know, I have some scientists on the horn here. They can corroborate whether or not this is scientifically plausible for a person to suddenly transform physically from being whatever human beings are made of into just good old NaCl that if you grind it up finely enough, you could put into a shaker, even though that's really disgusting. So the question is, what happened over here? So the intuitive literal reading of the text, which is adopted by the Talmud already, it's in Masechet Brachot. I just need a mouse, here we go. It's a halachic discussion in the Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, that if you see places where miracles occur, there are blessings that we are supposed to recite. One such blessing is if you see that pillar of salt from Mrs. Lot, that you see actually Mrs. Lot. The sages of the Talmud believe that not only did this happen literally, that she turned into a pillar of salt, but that you and I as tourists can see her. And then upon seeing her, we need to make a blessing that God has performed a miracle here. So there's actually a halachic consequence of their interpretation. Rashi on this passage, not surprisingly, interprets the story exactly that way. That Mrs. Lot became an actual pillar of salt, and this is the intuitive way of reading the story. Okay, so that you know, however, there are other ways of reading this story based on this discussion. It's all, you have the overarching philosophy discussion, and that seriously impacts on how you read every last one of these stories. So here's another way to read it. Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor was one of the Balei HaTosafot. And Radak, that's Rabbi David Kimchi in the 13th century. They're both 13th century commentators, one in France, northern France, one in Provence, in southern France. So they understand what this means is Mrs. Lot looked behind her, And she became a pillar of salt, not literally. She didn't turn into something that you could otherwise find in a salt shaker. She simply was overcome by whatever bombardment was clobbering the rest of the people of Sodom. In other words, what killed her is not some supernatural transformation of her bodily makeup, but simply that she got killed in the same manner in which all the other people of Sodom got killed. And her problem was that she delayed. So this was no longer a special thing that happened to her, but rather whatever was happening to the people of Sodom overtook her as well. So that's a middle position. So what's poor Ralbag going to do? Ralbag wants to interpret everything totally within the laws of nature, and you will not be disappointed. Here he comes to bat in this situation, and he says, Vatabet ishto me'acharav, Mrs. Lot looked behind her, Vatahi nitziv melach, and behold, she, the city, had turned into a pillar of salt. Cool stuff. He refuses to say that she turned into salt, because that's not within the laws of nature, at least as he understands them, and possibly the way we understand them as well. But he doesn't even like the overtaken by bombardment thing. He prefers to say, behold, the city was obliterated, which is exactly what the story is reporting. So he doesn't think that anything new happened here. He does think that she was overtaken by whatever bombarded the people of Sodom. He thinks that she died in this story. But Ralbag, using his principle of interpretation, completely reorients this verse and exploits an ambiguity that the Vatihi Nitziv Melach refers to the city, not to Mrs. Lot, even though Mrs. Lot is the immediately preceding subject. So it's just an entree into how these debates happen, where everybody's got a philosophical bias. You could read the verse the way that Ralbag reads it. It wasn't the smoothest way to read it at all. I think the JPS is much closer to the smoothest reading of the text, that Mrs. Lot is the subject and she turned into a pillar of salt, whether that means that she changed biologically or bodily, or whether it means that she was overtaken by this bombardment of sulfur and salt. But all the same, Ralbag is going to insist on his reading. Okay, traffic time. The Talmud explains the miracle of oil for the lamp of the Maccabees was that they had to fight the Philistines during Sukkot. Once they reoccupied, here you mean the Syrian Greeks, by the way, but understood. Once they reoccupied the temple, they finally could celebrate with the mitzvot they had earlier not been able to perform. Why is this not taught instead of the miracle? That's a great question, but that's going to take us very far afield. And at least I have the safety of telling you this is not a biblical miracle. So it's not the topic of today's shiur. It's a perfectly excellent question in terms of how the sages wanted to frame Chanukah and what lessons they wanted to derive from it, and the role of the Maccabees and the miracle of the oil and all. It's a fabulous shiur and one that I give, but it's a different one. So I'm gonna put that question on hold for the time being. Okay, another example. In the book of Joshua, the people need to enter the land, and there's this remarkable miracle, which is clearly meant to parallel the splitting of the Red Sea, because it's a river. So the Jordan River did not split; it piled up. In other words, it just stopped upstream, and then you had a great big pile. I always have to make sure in Zoom that when I do hand motions, that the hand ends up on the camera. Otherwise, what was the point? And so the river piled up somewhere north of where the people are, and then the downstream river keeps on going, and suddenly in the middle, dry land, voila. And that's where the Israelites would cross. Okay, so the way the text describes it in source number 5, now the Jordan keeps flowing over its entire bed throughout the harvest season. But as soon as the bearers of the ark reached the Jordan, the feet of the priests bearing the ark dipped into the water at its edge. The waters coming down from upstream piled up in a single heap a great way off at Adam. That's the name of a city here, Adam. The town next to Saratan, and those flowing away downstream to the Sea of the Arava ran out completely. So the people crossed near Jericho. Great. That's what happened. Okay, so the Zit people are going to say, okay, God basically put his non-existent hand on the Jordan River and stopped it up north near the town of Adam, which is some 20 miles north of where the Israelites were crossing near Jericho. And the Israelites now have some dry land to cross over. And then when God was done stopping up after all the nation crossed, okay, so God took his non-existent hand away and the water simply resumed its flow. What are the Rambams and the Ralbags of the world going to do? How in the world do you account for this within the natural order? And the answer is actually we have a modern day way of describing it very well. Periodically, the Jordan River stops up, nothing to do with God and Joshua and the Israelites crossing at the time of the biblical period. Every now and then, it's a rare occurrence, an avalanche can cause exactly this phenomenon. And we actually have catalogs of these avalanches. When they occur, there was one in the year 1267 that lasted for over 16 hours. Exactly this sort of phenomenon occurs. It's a rare occurrence, but it's a perfectly natural one. Avalanche happens, Jordan River piles up, people can cross, and it specifically happens at the time of year that is being described in the book of Joshua. It happened on the 10th day of Nisan, 5 days before Pesach, and that's when the Jordan River is its fullest, just because it's when the very, very end of the rainy season. And so these catalogs are very useful for the view of Rambam and Ralbag, because it exactly explains the way they would like to explain things, which is something dramatic happened. The people of Israel were able to cross the Jordan River in a way that otherwise they would not have been able to. It was perfectly timed. It was a miracle of great magnitude, but it worked completely within the natural order. Nothing supernatural happened here. It's simply an occurrence that we actually can document, and that occurs periodically, again, very rarely. But we have other occurrences of them, nothing to do with the nation of Israel trying to cross over, and they didn't have a bridge available. So God was able to simply time this very, very well for the people of Israel crossing at the time of Joshua. A much more dramatic example, and one of the greatest of all of the biblical miracles, is in the book of Joshua when the sun stops in the middle of the sky in chapter 10 of the book of Joshua. Here the issue is that Joshua is pursuing fleeing Canaanites, and he wants to capture and kill them before they get back into their walled cities. The problem is you can only do that when there is daylight. Once the sun sets, that's it. You have to call off your pursuit, and the Canaanites have a chance to escape. So Joshua did not want that to happen. So in source number 6 over here, on that occasion, when the Lord routed the Amorites before the Israelites, Joshua addressed the Lord. He said in the presence of the Israelites, "Stand still, O sun at Givon, O moon in the valley of Ayalon." And the sun stood still, and the moon halted, while a nation wreaked judgment on its foes. It worked. Amazingly enough, let's say it was a noontime sun. Great, so it just kept on being noontime for a while, and Joshua had more than ample time to overtake and capture all of the fleeing Canaanites. That's amazing. As is written in the book of Yashar. So there's already a footnote here. I mean, it's in the biblical text. I didn't use footnotes there. But it says, if you want more information, read the Sefer HaYashar, which is an ancient book, which chronicles whatever events, including this one, which we no longer have. We don't have this book. It's too bad. I would love to read some of these sources of the biblical text that we now have. It would be amazing to see how the book of Joshua uses that earlier epic or story or whatever it was. Thus the sun halted in mid-heaven and did not press on to set for a whole day. It sounds like, if you want to take this in a hyper-literal way, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky for 24 hours. That's really awesome. Okay, so fine. So you and I would say the earth stopped rotating for 24 hours. That's also pretty awesome. I would be very happy to not have been there at that moment, especially if we weren't there doing that. But all the same, that's how we would have to take this story if you just do this as a hyper-literal. God is transforming the laws of nature to help Joshua and the Israelites capture the Canaanites, right? For the Lord fought for Israel. Neither before nor since has there ever been such a day when the Lord acted on words spoken by a man. So the prophet goes out of his way to say, this was the best miracle ever on request. He's not making an objective statement about whether this is the best miracle ever, even though it is very impressive, but it's the best miracle on request ever. I mean, this is quite a big, tall order that Joshua is asking for. He's like, hey, God, can you make the sun stop? And it did, which gave him 24 additional hours to pursue and capture the fleeing Canaanites. That's awesome. All right, so what happened? So the literal reading of the text seems to be the sun stopped in the middle of the sky. And that's exactly how two of our great commentators interpret this. If you like the theory, it works out very nicely. So Rav Yosef Kara and Abarbanel also. Rav Yosef Kara was a 12th century northern French commentary, not at all to be confused with Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, even though he has a very similar sounding name. Different person. He was a colleague of Rashi, Rabbi Yosef Kara, and actually he earned his last name. Kara just meant the Tanakh expert. That's why he got his name. His buddies called him that because that was his specialty, and everybody thought he was the man. So that's how he got his last name. His parents' last name was not Kara. This was simply a nickname that became part of his name onward. Abarbanel is the well-known figure from the time of the Spanish expulsion. And so these two commentators just take for granted that, okay, the sun really did stop rotating or moving across the sky, and Joshua had a noonday sun for a full 24 hours. Which gave him more than ample time to catch the fleeing Canaanites. So what are poor Rambam and Ralbag going to do here? And the answer is, what happened on a supernatural or natural order? The answer is, believe it or not, absolutely nothing. Now, I don't know, I just read the story with you. It sounds like something very grand happened over here. But as far as they're concerned, absolutely nothing happened. If you and I were standing as objective outside observers in this story, we would not at all see any change in the natural order. What did happen is a change in the people's perceptions. Joshua thought that it was literally impossible to capture the Canaanites. He would never get the job done. But then, miracle of miracles, he did. He was able to overtake the fleeing Canaanites. And therefore, it felt to him as though the sun stopped in the middle of the sky. But in fact, nothing at all happened. If you and I were there and weren't involved in this battle, the sun would have set exactly when our internet would have told us sunset tonight in Canaan or in the land of Israel is this time. That's exactly when it set. Nothing bigger happened than that. It was a pure perception. I don't think I have any control over muting people. So again, just a request to please mute yourselves. That would be great. Thank you so much. So that's how they understand this story, that the story is not written from an objective what happened perspective, but rather it's written from the perception of the character's perception. But nothing happened. And that's because it sure sounds like a great big miracle happened, but their bias is, no, we don't want to see God stopping the sun in the middle of the sky. Hypothetically, God could do anything, but it would offend our philosophical sensibilities. And therefore, in fact, absolutely nothing happened. Needless to say, this incurs the extreme wrath of Abarbanel, who goes ballistic. He can't stand this kind of interpretation. He believes that in this sort of situation, it simply violates the text. The text is saying some great big miracle happened. And to say that, okay, what really happened is nothing other than shock of shocks, they caught up with their enemies, Abarbanel, let's put this very mildly, does not like this one bit. And so he just goes bananas. Ralbag in particular takes a great deal of wrath from Abarbanel in this situation. Nowadays, we actually have alternating theories that are perhaps better for Rambam and Ralbag, if you're more in line to say that nature did not change, but rather just something grand and unusual happened. One is closer to the text, and one is just super duper cool. One theory that is out there, which matches what's going on in the narrative in Joshua, is that perhaps there was just a great big hailstorm with a huge cloud cover. The story itself, not in the passage that I showed you, but read the whole passage. God is bombarding the Canaanites with stones. Okay, so how about hailstones? That would hurt, and it would certainly bewilder the Canaanites, and it would help Joshua overtake them as long as the Israelites are not getting equally clobbered. Otherwise, what's the point? Everybody's getting hit and runs for cover. It's not going to help. So, and plus the sky would get really, really dark, leading Joshua to think night is coming. So he prays for more daylight, and sure, there was more daylight because it was just really cloudy. So once the cloud cover breaks, it was still very sunny, or at least sunny enough to catch the enemies, and that's it. That's one contemporary theory for that. My personal favorite, whether or not this is true, is the good old solar eclipse. So using astronomical charts, we even have a date for you. It would have been on October 31, 1207 BCE. Pretty cool, huh? Excuse me, I'm sorry, October 30. The newspaper article that I was talking about was, so the thing was actually October 30. Sorry. Everything else is the same. That particular eclipse is handy in terms of A, it happened, at least according to current astronomical records, projecting backwards. B, it seems to match the general period in which Joshua is entering the land. And C, it's really cool. I was reading some neat articles just about the psychology of a solar eclipse if you're not wearing a watch. So an eclipse, a long eclipse, is just a couple of minutes. It's really not a long time, but several articles have discussed how people, even in the modern period, who lived through a solar eclipse and estimated how much time did it feel like to you, gave ridiculous, there was one that happened in Sudan in the 1800s, where they reported people who lived through it thought that it lasted for 2 hours. The thing lasted under 2 minutes. So the psychology of that is amazing, because the way you would project that back into our story, if this is correct, is that Joshua sees it getting dark and thinks that night is falling. It's like, oh no, let the sun stop in the middle of the sky. And then in comes the eclipse. It gets really dark. But then after what feels like a very long time, it's sunny again. And it's really just a couple minutes later. In other words, the sun will still be stopped in the middle of the sky, because the sun's position has hardly moved. It's just been a minute or two. It would certainly not be a perceptible difference unless you have really good, sophisticated instruments. It would seem like, wow, the sun stopped in the middle of the sky for a long time. And now look, there's still daylight. Let's go pursue our enemies. So within the Rambam and Ralbag camp, I much prefer something like that. I don't have any bias one way or the other. If God wants to change nature and that's what God wants to do, that's fine. If God does not want to change nature, that's fine too. My religious experience is not predicated on God having to do amazing gymnastics in nature. The fact that he created nature is impressive enough for me. And that's how our commentators like Rambam and Ralbag understand it. Yes, that's already a very impressive track record. But within the way of reading this story, it's critical to have, what I like about this view is that now something happened. It's not just the perception of the characters, but it would be something big in nature that occurred that's unusual and very, very well timed. I mean, there've been not that many solar eclipses over Israel over a 200-year period at that era. Okay, so that one happened during this battle is really cool. And that's what we would be describing in this situation. Okay, moving on to a different example where also it taxes the Ralbag camp in a big way. Skip down to source number 8 for this one. So the prophet Elisha, who was the disciple of Elijah the prophet, Eliyahu Hanavi. So in general, the Eliyahu and Elisha narratives are much more miraculous sounding than even standard biblical narratives everywhere else. So they do all kinds of amazing things that go far and beyond the typical biblical miracle. So one good one is that back in the good old days, instead of kollels where men didn't have jobs, but rather just learned Torah. Back in the good old days, you had the Bnei HaNevi'im. These were the disciples of the prophets who also had no real job, and they were dirt poor, and they left their homes, if they had homes, and simply studied under the prophets and had no income. And this story that we're going to look at is based on that premise. So one of them had borrowed an axe, and Nebuch, they didn't glue on the axe head too well, so it flew right off the handle and fell into the water. So here goes. As one of them, source 8, as one of them was felling a trunk, the iron axe head fell into the water. And he cried aloud, alas, master, it was a borrowed one. In other words, he's so poor, he can't afford to pay back the price of the axe. So he's oh no, am I going to have to be sold into slavery? What's going to happen? I can't pay this guy back. He's really fretting over this. Where did it fall? Asked the man of God, referring to Elisha. He showed him the spot, and he cut off a stick and threw it in, and he made the axe head float. Pick it up, he said. So he reached out and took it. All right, so that's pretty cool, right? So he takes the axe handle, which is made of wood, and he throws it in the water, and so the wood sinks, and then the iron axe head floats. So all the experiments that you do with preschoolers are out the window here. But the whole idea is, okay, the basic gist of the story is, wowee, God has bent the laws of nature. And that's how most of our commentators read this story. There's no good naturalistic way to explain it. So I'll bet you're all waiting to hear what Ralbag does here. You won't be disappointed. Ralbag here is up against a wall, and he says, okay, this was just like the best throw ever. Like Olympic javelin throwers have nothing on Elisha. Elisha wound up, threw it with incredible force, and so much so that the force carried it down under the water. And because he had the most amazing precision aim in the history of the universe, it went right into the hole of the axe handle and then floated the whole thing up. So needless to say, Abarbanel is unhappy again, and he goes bananas. And by the 19th century, Malbim, just shrugs it off and says, here goes Ralbag with his hevel again. Hevel means nonsense. It's like, come on, how far can you push the laws of interpretation? Like either you interpret the story the way that it's meant to be read or do something else. But it's very difficult to give this a naturalistic explanation. But all the same, Ralbag is doing this because of his view. Okay, it's obviously unlikely to make such a throw, but he just doesn't want it to be something that requires God to actually make wood sink or make iron float. He doesn't want that to happen. Iron sinks, wood floats. That's the way that it goes. Okay, so he needs some naturalistic, no matter how remote of a possibility it is, to make this happen. Okay, so that's how he does it. Okay, Marshall Wagner, from a psychological point of view, I need to believe in miracles. It's part of my emunah. Could you comment on that when it's appropriate time in the shiur? Keep on believing. Don't let your emunah in any way be disrupted by the shiur. I'm not even taking a side in the shiur. I don't need to. My emunah is perfectly content in both directions. So I don't have any issues whatsoever with one way or the other. But for people who want God to be able to bend the laws of nature, and for them that's a central cornerstone, guess what? There are very great, powerful interpreters within our tradition that interpret the text that way. And so keep right on interpreting that way. I don't want to take anything away from your faith or to make it even threatened as a result of the shiur. All I'm saying is that there's a totally other side of our tradition. And my job is to make sure that they stand in dialogue with one another, because they're both perfectly valid views within our traditional orbit. And that's something which is important to me, that people have very different ways of building their emunah, whether they have a hard time understanding biblical miracles as God suspending the laws of nature. Some people have a problem with that, especially in the modern age, right? And some people want God to be able to bend the laws of nature. I'm not getting in the middle of what God does. God can do whatever God wants to do. I'm interested in both camps of our commentators involving some of the most revered names in the business have taken diametrically opposed views. And my job is always to set them out there without the venom. In other words, there's a lot of venom in this discussion where people like Rambam and Ralbag think that the view is stupid. And that's just what the foolish masses think. Whereas the Abarbanels of the world think that Rambam and Ralbag violate the basic text interpretation rules, and therefore their views are not compatible with good faith. So to me, the whole point is getting them to be able to sit at a table without the venom. And that's what the shiur is about with this particular topic. I mean, I could do this with any topic, because you'll always have very hostile debates within our tradition, defining the boundaries of what is a fair way to read the Torah and what is it trying to teach. And our job is to try to just show, I don't need to make them agree. In fact, I can't make them agree. And I don't want them to agree. I'm glad that they disagree, so that different people of faith can come to an understanding of Torah and God totally different from somebody else. And they're both quite valid. They're both well within the paths of our tradition. Okay, this from Rabbi Kaplowitz. I don't want to call that traffic, but all the same, let's see what he has to say. The rationalist camp would say that the miracle is that the natural phenomenon happened at the exact moment it was needed. The real wonder is that God set up nature from creation, that these things would happen when needed. Yes, within the rationalist camp, some tie that into how God created the world in the first place. 100% correct. Certainly the timing is a relevant piece of understanding the miracle here. However God chooses to do that, whether it's built into creation and nature or whether God just does this, but still within the natural order. In other words, did God build into nature that an axe handle at that exact moment had to float? There's a debate over how to read the actual creation in that, but you're certainly right that is a view taken and that Rambam uses to explain a Mishnah in Pirkei Avot already. You're certainly correct about that. But it's not the only way to understand miracles, but the timing is certainly part of it. Okay, my favorite example is that there's a huge debate in our system about the two stories in Tanakh where, as much as the general view of Tanakh is once you're dead, you're dead. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, he dies, that's it. We don't know where his grave is, but there's no goes to God. Of course, there's always that shot that he'll come back. No, he's not going to come back. And yet, in the Eliyahu and Elisha narrative cycle, sure enough, each one of them brings a child who had been dead back to life. With God's help, of course, but still, this defies everything that the rest of Tanakh is going to say. So sources 9 and 10 are those excerpts, just that you have your sources. We don't need to read them. That's what happens. So there is a view going back to the medieval period that Rambam and Radak quote, where there's a debate whether this was Tchiyat HaMetim, where somebody who actually was dead now is alive, meaning it's just a full-blown, God defied his own typical laws of life and death and brought these children back to life on request, or whether the Eliyahu and Elisha were the very first Hatzalah volunteers. And what they're doing here is mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and other forms of therapy, so that a comatose child who seemed dead to us regular folk, they were in fact not dead. And that they simply revived people who seemed to be dead to come back to life, that they were conscious. So in this case, even Rambam rejects it. Even though Rambam tends to favor a naturalistic thing, he thinks that that's just too far off the charts. He thinks that these stories talk about a dead child coming back to life. But all the same, there is a view that Rambam and Radak and others quote, that this was the very first, that these were the first two Hatzalah volunteers. So again, to outsiders like us, non-medically trained people, wow, it's a miracle. But in fact, the child never was technically clinically dead. The child was simply comatose or whatever it was, unconscious, and now has come back to life. And to bring this home, so that's my all-time favorite debate, just because, wow, what a difference of opinion in terms of what just happened. But it's all part of the same debate. It really is the same thing, whether it's a woman turning into a pillar of salt or not, or whether it's a person coming back from the dead. So these stories are either trying to describe uncannily outlying miracles even from within the biblical narrative, or no, the miracle workers, in fact, were simply working within the laws of nature, and that no law of nature was bent at all. God simply showed them techniques that would be able to revive an otherwise comatose child. So finally, getting over to the fact that Pesach is coming, we got to do something about the plagues. I actually spoke at Netivot. I checked my notes in 2012, where I outlined this piece of the shiur, but so I want to make sure I know that I'd spoken about the plagues itself at Netivot in some earlier time, but A, some people who are at Netivot now may not have been there in 2012. B, people who might have been there in 2012 might not have heard that shiur. And 3, of course, there are people on the horn here who are not at Netivot even now. Although definitely if you're in the Baltimore area, you got to join. And so when it comes to the plagues, the same debate appears, where one view understands that God is simply going time and again through nature, violating the laws of nature and smiting the living daylights out of the Egyptians in order to redeem the people of Israel. And the other camp looks for naturalistic claims. And this goes back to the medieval period. Even somebody like Abarbanel, who took the more supernatural approach to several of the texts that we've seen today, in this story, he thinks that it was all the laws of nature, simply because he doesn't think there's anything in the text that warrants a supernatural interpretation. Meaning in the case of the sun stopping in the middle of the sky, he doesn't see any good naturalistic reading. So therefore, he believes the prophets that, okay, here God bent the laws of nature. But in the story of the plagues, there doesn't seem to be anything that bends the laws of nature. The stuff that does bend the laws of nature is the stuff that you learn in Midrash that is filtered through Rashi. Good example is the plague of blood. The plague of blood, so the way I was taught it, it's so cool this way, right? That if an Israelite held a Dixie cup of water, so it was water, you could drink it. But even if you wanted to be a nice guy and hand it over to an Egyptian, and the Egyptian tried to drink it, it would suddenly turn into blood. So that's awesome. Okay, so that obviously requires a supernatural interpretation of everything because it's the same cup of water. But if you read the Torah doesn't say this at all. Not only does it not say this at all, what's wacky is that the Nile River turns to blood, and the Egyptians very calmly seem to know exactly how to handle that, which is let's dig underground. They don't seem phased. I don't know, to me, if your main water supply, at least in the Nile Delta, suddenly is blood, I would get nervous. And yet for them, they're just like, all right, get out the shovels, let's go. And they dig and they all get water and it all seems perfectly good. Clearly the water that they got from underground sources did not then turn into blood, or else where are they wasting their time and energy? Sounds like they just knew how to handle that. And several of our commentators who take a more supernatural interpretation of the plagues struggle over things like this because they realize, okay, it doesn't sound like water turned into the stuff that's coursing through our body. It sounds like the water just turned red. Right? And frogs is frogs and lice is lice and arov, whatever kind of swarms they were, whether, my children's play kit, of course, rules that it's a wild beast like lions, whereas other midrashim and commentators think that it could have been swarms of flies, or Rashbam thinks that they're wolves altogether, whatever they were, or cattle disease or boils or hailstorms or locusts. Guess what? These things occur. And the Torah doesn't seem to be going out of its way to describe them in any supernatural terms. It just sounds like these were very well timed and very big, exactly what Rambam and Ralbag will commonly say, but not necessarily that any laws of nature were broken. There was a Dutch scholar in 1957 tried to come up with a causal approach. Her name is Greta Hort, where she thinks that there were very specific, there are ways of describing A, causal chains of events, and B, why the Nile Delta would be afflicted, whereas the land of Goshen would not be afflicted. Okay, so this is her theory, which could be right, could be not right, I don't care, but I'm never interested in, is this what happened? I'm interested in just a mechanism of how to interpret the Torah. So the way she understands it is that the plague of blood was a lot of sediment being washed in from Ethiopia, red sediment, because of unusually heavy rainfall. And this sediment was not only red, but it contained a lot of bacteria. And that enters the Nile. All right, so what happens? Nile turns red, and the bacteria kills the fish. And a lot of dead fish at one time can be really stinky. All right, so out come the frogs. But Nabach, the frogs got the same bacterial infection that the fish had, so they all dropped dead en masse also. Once you have a lot of frog carcasses all over the place, that also smells, and then of course that will attract mosquitoes and lice and things like that, right? So that's one trio of plagues. Moving on to the next one, arov, which again just means swarms. It can be swarms of anything. I happen to agree with Hort, regardless of how you interpret whether this is causal or not. It makes more sense to me, at least, that we're dealing with swarms of some kind of insect rather than big beasts, just because they enter the houses, they come in through the windows. It sounds very much like we're dealing with swarms of small creatures rather than big ones. Other than that, whatever goes, goes. Well, if they are some kind of insect, so she prefers the good old stable fly. And the reason for this is that it's a blood-sucking insect that can multiply in tropical climates, but not in a Mediterranean climate like Goshen. And it's important to note that the Torah distinguishes between the people of Israel and Egypt, specifically with this plague of Arov. It does not say that the Israelites were immune to the first three plagues. So imagine this. These stable flies come and chomp everything in sight in the Nile Delta. All right, so if they chomp animals, they get a cattle disease. If they chomp people, they get boils. Voila. So that's the next couple of plagues for you. Okay, she then goes on to describe how both hailstorms and locust plagues can very well affect the tropical Nile Delta region, but will not affect, based on wind patterns and locust patterns in that region, will not afflict Goshen, which is a Mediterranean climate. And then, well, if the locusts and the hail and the locusts destroy the crops, that's an excellent time for a very strong wind system to blow up all of the dust, because there's going to be a lot of it. Voila, you get a chamsin, and that's the plague of darkness. The chamsin is simply going to be a thick darkness, exactly as described by the Torah. So I don't know if this theory is right or not, nor am I specifically interested if this theory is right. I happen to think it's really cool. It explains things very, very nicely. And it also happens to support the view of Shadal, by the way, which is good just in its own right. Rav Shmuel David Luzzatto in the 19th century Italy, he just makes an important observation. He thinks that, you know, if you take a supernatural reading of the plagues, then it's easy to keep Hashem plagued the Egyptians, God plagued the Egyptians, but did not plague the Israelites, because God can control where the locusts go and whose leaves to eat. But if you're dealing with within the laws of nature, it should be locust ate every single plant there. Okay, so Shadal agrees with that. He takes a naturalistic approach and he says like this: the plagues did not affect Goshen, but they did affect the Nile Delta. But it doesn't matter who you are. If you're an Israelite living in the Nile Delta, guess what? You got clobbered too. You weren't immune to these plagues. Whereas if you were an Egyptian living in Goshen, you also were safe. Because why not? If the locust plague is afflicting the Nile Delta, okay, so nobody got afflicted in Goshen. Same thing with the plague of darkness and all the other ones. It has to do with where you were rather than who you are. So that's taking a naturalistic approach, and that seems to match the way, at least most of the Torah's descriptions. Rav Joseph Soloveitchik, I think, did an excellent job, not that he needs my praises, and yet one of the many books that he's published since he passed away on Pesach in 1993. This one is called The Emergence of Ethical Man. So we're blessed, those of us who are too young to have ever had the privilege to have heard Rav Soloveitchik at all, are at least lucky to have the notes of him being published by his students. It's really a great privilege and pleasure to at least get that taste of his world. So Rav Soloveitchik in this book, The Emergence of Ethical Man, says how the Torah goes out of its way to present the plagues of Egypt in the most naturalistic manner possible. He understands that regardless of how you understand miracles, you can't help but notice that the Torah is not bending over backwards to show that God is bending the laws of nature. it doesn't. It sounds very much like these could be interpreted in a naturalistic way. And the point is to teach that when God acts in history, that is a miracle according to the Torah. It doesn't matter if God is suspending natural law or not. What matters is if God is involved in history, that is a miracle. And that could be a purely naturalistic event, or that could be a purely not naturalistic event. And that is true across the boards. So that to me is the best way of bridging the two views that we've talked about this whole shiur, namely the view where God interferes with the laws of nature itself, and the naturalistic view, which is God never or seldom interferes with the laws of nature. The point is that the Torah is interested in understanding that God is involved in this world, and that's what we celebrate on Pesach, regardless of how you understand the plagues or the splitting of the Red Sea and all of those things. The mechanics of the miracle are much less important in the overall scheme of things than that we recognize that God is involved in history and God cares about justice in this world. And that's what the foundational episode of Pesach is really all about. Scrolling back over, reminds me of Billy Crystal said that Wesley is only mostly dead. Very good. So I'm sorry I didn't catch that thing. Does anyone interpret Makat Bechorot in a non-zit way? So very good. So Makat Bechorot, the plague of the firstborn, is even where Hort hangs up her hat and says, it's hard to explain that one. I have read more naturalistic theories having to do with firstborns perhaps being involved in some kind of ritual in Egypt, which somehow had a contagious disease in this case. I find that less exciting. The first 9, they sound great. If Hort is right, I have no qualms whatsoever. Whereas the plague of the firstborn sounds like direct divine interference, and that's the way the Torah itself casts it. So I have seen some efforts at trying to make even that 10th plague more naturalistic, but I find them already, I can see where Barbanel would react with venom. They're saying the Torah is going out of its way to say God personally is going door to door. So once you have God going door to door, it sounds like this is direct divine intervention rather than some disease that happens to have afflicted people who were oldest in each family because they were involved in some ritual, and Nebuch, there was a contamination of whatever it was, and that's what killed them all out. But I have seen efforts at this, but that just seems textually far less plausible. I want to conclude the shiur, and then we have a few more minutes for Q&A. Hold on one second. For this, I will share a screen. I just need to get it on my screen. Okay. Hello, no, help stage. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Oh, I can't do that. Okay, so then what I can do is put it in chat. I just need a plan B. There you go, voila. The Talmud, when talking about what we call the Ashrei, Psalm 145, it's called that colloquially because we preface Tehillah the David with a couple of verses beginning with the word Ashrei from elsewhere in Psalms. And so it says, Rav Elazar ben Avina says, whoever recites this psalm of praise of David 3 times daily is sure to inherit the world to come, which, by the way, is a great deal. Let me just slide in. It's actually a better deal than that. That text that we have in front of us, which is in our printed editions, is not the original text of the Talmud. The original text of the Talmud is we only have to say it once daily to earn our share in the world to come. It's a better bargain than you even thought. And what happened is the Geonim saw that and like, wow, that's great. Let's have Jews say this 3 times daily to increase odds of at least getting it in there once, but then that found its way into the text. But the real text is actually once daily, and that's enough to get a share in the world to come. So what is the reason? Shall I say it is because it has an alphabetical arrangement? As you know, the Ashrei is arranged with an Aleph, a Bet, a Gimel, a Dalet, and so on. It's an acrostic. So that's considered a sign of complete praise of God. Don't worry about the fact that there's a verse without a nun. It's still a complete praise of God, okay? Well, if that's the case, though, if you want to deal with a complete acrostic, then let them recite, happy are they that are upright in the way, Psalm 119. That's the granddaddy of them all. That one has 8 verses beginning with Aleph, and then 8 beginning with Bet, and then 8 beginning with Gimel, and it doesn't even skip the nun. So it ends up with a whopping 8 times 22 verses, or 176 verses if my math is right, which is by far the longest chapter in the entire Tanakh. Okay, so if acrostics are what get you to the world to come, so read the best acrostic of them all. It's eight acrostics through. Okay, so which has an 8-fold alphabetical arrangement. Again, is it because it contains the verse, you open your hand and satisfy every living thing with favor. That's the verse in Hebrew. Poteach et yadecha u'matzbeah l'chol chai ratzon. then let him recite the great Hallel, Psalm 136, where it is written, who gives food to all flesh. Noten lechem l'chol basar, ki le'olam chasto. Rather, the reason is because it contains both. All right, so here's what's cool to me about this Talmudic passage for now. I mean, there are many cool things that we discuss in a shiur on that psalm. Psalm 136, that's the da-da-da-da, ki le'olam chasto, da-da-da-da, ki le'olam chasto. It's called Hallel HaGadol, or the Great Praise. We recite it every Shabbat. That whole psalm is about how God created the world and that God redeemed the people of Israel from Egypt. Ki le'olam chasto. Meaning these great, amazing signs of divine power. What this Talmudic passage considers more impressive of God than either creating the world or the Exodus is the fact that noten lechem l'chol basar ki le'olam chasto, that God feeds us on a day-to-day basis. That's the more impressive verse, and that's why in the Ashrei, potach et yadecha masbe'el chol chai ratzon, that daily sustenance of individuals that God does, and obviously that we should emulate, is considered a greater miracle than even creation and the Exodus in that sense. And that's what our tradition favors. So when we go through miracles and we talk about the season of miracles with Pesach, so first of all, it's important to just pay attention to this grand debate of our commentators. And that's been the focus of today. But there's this secondary component, which is the great stories are meant to trigger a day-to-day religious life involving chesed, Torah study, serving God and serving our community and beyond, serving the world, which vastly eclipses the value of these great foundational miraculous stories. And with this, I want to thank again Rabbi Kaplowitz and Netivot Shalom for having me, and thank all of you for coming, whether you are in Baltimore or whether you are anywhere else. The great thing about Zoom continues as far as that is concerned. And I want to wish everybody a Chodesh Tov and a wonderful Pesach. We have a minute or two more if there are any last second chats. Otherwise, I want to turn it back over to Rabbi Kaplowitz, and I want to thank you all again and wish you a wonderful Moadim L'Simcha, Chag Sameach, wonderful Pesach in advance. Oh, you are most welcome. Okay, hold on one second. How would Rambam Ralbag explain the Gemara on brachot to make a bracha over a personal miracle? When does one say such a bracha? I don't know what Rambam would say about Yom HaTzmaut. That's already a big question. But again, for them taking this to be miracles, they would still see these one-off, incredibly rare events as miraculous. I don't see why they would not say a bracha if they saw the destroyed ruins of Sodom, or if they found the stone on which Moshe sat when he raised his hands. Even if no laws of nature were bent, we would still view this as, the way they understand it, as a miracle. Rabbi Halev, I just want to say, I saw you from the beginning. It's so wonderful to see you, and may God bless you. We're old friends and learned at Smicha together, so it's wonderful that you were able to join. Thank you so much.
Okay,
most
if
pleasurable.
there's no more final questions, I really want to thank Rabbi Angel for this fascinating, wonderful tour through Tanakh and exploration of this really important topic. Hopefully gives everyone much to think about as we prepare for Pesach and how we tell the story, how we make sense of it, and all these important questions that you raised. You gave us at least 2 more topics for future shiurim that we hope we'll be able to learn with you in the future, hopefully in person real soon as everything lifts. As a reminder, Kodesh Press is offering a 10% discount on their entire catalog through Monday evening. I put the link again in the chat. They have a number of Rabbi Angel's books and other wonderful books for you to browse and take advantage of that offer. This was wonderful. It's great to see so many people, familiar faces and new faces, and familiar names and new names. Wish everyone a Chag Sameach. Our full schedule of upcoming shiurim at the shul, as well as information for Mechirat Chametz, for selling your Chametz, is on the shul website. Thank you, Rabbi Angel, again. Thank you, everyone who made this happen, and wish everyone a Chodesh Tov and a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Bye-bye, everybody.